Let me introduce myself first of all. My name is Jenkins. I'm Chairman of Ealing, Hammersmith and Hounslow LMC, and Mohini this afternoon asked me to talk briefly about something about any qualified provider status, perhaps about the opportunities that it might offer and also the threats that may come with it. So I'm very conscious of the fact that quite a lot of you in the audience here are not GPs, so I think what I'd better do is take you back down to basic principles about how general practice is funded. Bear with me to make sure that I can make this operate. No, I can't. Let's try again. Okay. That isn't the slide I was expecting. Right, interesting. Okay, you'll have to bear with me a moment, all right? What I'll do is talk from the slides that I did prepare, not the ones that you've got in front of you. Okay, so what I wanted to do first of all was to talk about how general practice is actually funded. And I think you need to start in 2004 with the new general practice contract. You will know, some of you will know, and if the others don't know, then I will talk about it. Basically, general practice is funded through a variety of measures, primarily three. So first of all, practices have something called the global sum. Global sum is something that is a nationally agreed formula, and it's dependent on practice size. So it's altered for deprivation, but basically it is what you get paid for your core work. Back in 2004, when the global sum was worked out for a variety of practices across the nation, it transpired quite rapidly that we weren't being paid the same amount of money as we were before, historically, for the work that we did. So the government introduced something called MPIG, which was the Minimum Practice Income Guarantee, which made sure that if practices weren't earning what they were earning historically, that they got a top-up. So as your practice list size increased, your global sum actually went up, and your MPIG payments got smaller until you got to a position where some of you are no longer being paid MPIG, and so that basically means that you are more or less on the same amount of money for your core contract that's coming into your practice as it was over the last 6 years. So after 2006, for the next 6 years, for the actual core contract, general practice was paid more or less the same. Now, the other thing that you need to understand is that the practice expenses, staff, other expenses, general expenses for running a business, have been going up. So in effect, it means that for your core general practice, we've actually been paid less money as the last 6 years have gone by. Now, the important thing that has enabled practices to continue is something called enhanced services. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about enhanced services and how that might be influenced in the future by something called any qualified provider. So enhanced services are basically divided into basically three types. There is a national enhanced service and a directed enhanced service, which some practices obviously do attract money into, or money from, but also you get local enhanced services which were agreed by the PCT and now are agreed with the CCG. So those are the various types of practice funding. Now, as Mohini mentioned in her presentation, from April of next year, the National Commissioning Board will take over responsibilities for GMS, PMS and APMS contracts. They'll also take on responsibilities for paying practices for national enhanced services and directed enhanced services. The locally enhanced services, which to be honest, actually contribute quite a substantial proportion of the income that's coming into practices currently, something like maybe 20 to 25% of the money coming into practices is probably being earned through local enhanced services. The local enhanced services from April of next year are going to change slightly. Half of them are classified as what's called health promotion or public health local enhanced schemes. Those would be the things like smoking cessation. They'd be other ones like health promotions, cardiovascular screening, smoking cessation services. and those will transfer to the local authority under a contract and a payment which has not yet been determined. However, the rest of the local enhanced services, which will be contracted by the CCG, could be put out to something called any qualified provider. Now, I do say could, because that basically means that it's the CCG's choice, as far as I'm aware. They're not being actually directed to do it as yet, but it is still CCG's choice from April of next year how they do go forward with leases, whether or not they continue with les contracts as they are at the moment, or whether or not they move to an any qualified provider basis. Now, what is an any qualified provider, and why has it been introduced? So it's been introduced as a new concept by this present government. The idea is that it's meant to increase choice for patients. It's meant to empower patients and their carers. It's meant to improve quality. It's meant to enable innovation and change. And it's going to encourage new providers of healthcare into our system. And as some of you will already know, private providers in the NHS system are beginning to proliferate all over the place. You will know that recently Care UK has taken over the local Harmony contract, and that, for instance, they now serve a substantial proportion of the population throughout the UK. So that's an example of a private provider coming into NHS services. So what is a qualified provider? It's basically a service provider, and it could be a GP practice, it could be a network of GP practices, or just a group of practices working together. The important things that you need to understand is that the organisation has to be registered with the CQC. Well, I hope most of you in the audience have already been delving away at CQC over the past few months, so that's not such a big hurdle. You have to agree a standard NHS contract with terms of service. That might be a bit more difficult. There's an agreed fixed payment or possibly a national tariff for the service. You have to demonstrate that you have a track record of delivery, which for general practice for some of our leases may not be difficult to do. You have to be transparent and open about managing conflicts of interest. You don't get any guarantee of any payment, so if nobody comes to your service, you won't get any payment. And you also would be assessed under a rigorous requirements for NHS services. So it's quite a hurdle for practices to go for, and I think it would be probably a good idea to consider whether or not practices could work together to achieve any qualified provider status if indeed it becomes a serious threat. I'm not saying that it's guaranteed to become, but it's something that we really need to consider. So, what's happened so far? What I will tell you for any qualified provider status, for the year 2012-2013, the Department of Health directed the CCG, or Ealing PCT at the time, and the CCG, to be able to choose one of three of a list of services. So any qualified provider status is already here. I think adult hearing services probably are already covered on this basis. And let me just tell you what that means. That means that if you're a GP and you've got a patient in front of you that has a problem with their hearing, now you have a choice of providers. You've always had a choice before, but now you've got a larger choice of providers that you can refer to. I think there may be even 7, well, certainly quite a few providers that you can now offer audiology services to. Right, okay. So the next thing is that the government for next year, 2013-2014, have offered another list from which the CCG will possibly need to choose to drive into any qualified provider status. That involves maternity, antenatal education, breastfeeding, speech and language therapy, long-term conditions, self-management support, community chemotherapy. So there are about 5 or 6 of these things that it looks as if the Department of Health and the government is trying to drive into this competitive market. Okay, so let's talk about threats to practice income. So if the CCG did decide that it was going to put our traditional lenses out to any qualified provider, that certainly would provide a threat to our practice income. And since, as I've already indicated at the beginning, if we are already managing to survive just on the basis of our local enhanced services, then if that disappears, then quite a lot of practices are going to have difficulties being able to maintain their income. The other possibility is that if CCGs go, and I'm talking generally about CCGs, not about Ealing, and if CCGs decide to go to any qualified provider status for lenses, they may want to drive down the price that we're currently being paid for the services that we're offering under lenses. Any qualified provider actually drives services towards profit-driven companies. Large companies may decide to offer some services as loss leaders, in other words, prepared to offer the service for either a vastly reduced price or alternatively no money at all. And as I said before, there is no guarantee of any volume or income in one of these contracts. So basically, you could be offering the service but still not getting any income. And patients may become vulnerable to private marketing from the companies involved. So let me just sort of recap. I think that there are some possible advantages for GPs to look at any qualified provider status. But if you're going to do that, I think you need to consider whether or not you're going to do it as a group of practices, and it may well help us afternoon to think about that. I will tell you that London-wide LMCs will be providing training for any qualified provider status, so that if you are interested, then that is something that you'll be able to take up. I know that Ealing CCG, and Mohini particularly, is very keen for practices to at least be aware of this impending change and prepare themselves. And the LMC and the Ealing CCG are perfectly happy to work in collaboration in order to be able to try and get them to the standard that may be required in order to be successful in any qualified provider status. The other thing that you need to understand is that you are basically the CCG. You may have a group of people that sit on the board, but you are the CCG. So to a certain extent, it is your choice whether or not you go down this road. I'll finish. Sorry about this.